This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from all around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/Yarzade. Before we get into this video, I just really want to give a special thanks to Nayvild and Aishio because without them, this video would not be here at all. They were a huge help in helping me complete it, and I cannot thank them enough because otherwise this would be yet another idea of mine left to collect dust on my shelf of incomplete things. So thank you guys. Kindred, the award-winning novel from Octavia E. Butler, is separated into 8 sections, each seamlessly blending into the other. The prologue, where Butler opens with the protagonist, Dana, waking up in the hospital to interrogated police officers and a newly amputated left arm. She writes this with just enough detail, never overly expository, leaving elements unexplained, making us curious enough to need to know more about what circumstances led to this aftermath. Even the first sentence is enough to eat at us. I lost an arm on my last trip home. Simple, but loaded with questions. What does home mean to this protagonist? It must be a dangerous place. The section also describes Dana's husband, Kevin, being held at the police station as they suspect him of having caused Dana's injury. When they finally release Kevin at Dana's insistence, she asks him what he told the officers. The truth. He toyed with my hand for a moment silently. I looked at him, found him watching me. If you told those deputies the truth, I said softly, you'd still be locked up in a mental hospital. Sandwiched between the prologue and the epilogue are the river, the fire, the fall, the fight, the storm, and the rope, each part following Dana on a trip back home. In 1976, Dana, a writer in Los Angeles, starts experiencing an unexplainable phenomenon. She is slipping into a different place in a vastly different time. The slips happen without warning, without planning, and without Dana's control over any of it. If she could control it, she would not be time traveling at all, especially not to the era she keeps getting sent to, a Maryland plantation in 1815. The first thing she notices is that all her trips involve a young boy named Rufus, the incorrigible son of a plantation owner, Mr. Whalen. On her numerous trips, Dana realizes that her ancestors were kept as slaves on the very plantation she's slipping into, and that Rufus is also one of her ancestors. This realization makes her instances of reluctant time travel a fight for survival in more ways than one. What she experiences on those trips are the traumatic origins of a country and of her own family, built on anguish and exploitation. She's disgusted. But when she learns she's a descendant of Alice, a free black woman, and Rufus, she has to ensure the two of them have children in order for her to continue existing. The novel poses these grand philosophical questions in such an accessible way, which was important to Butler. Her writing had been criticized as being overly simple, but that's part of what makes it work so well. Her work is poignant, approachable, honest, and grueling. In Kindred, Dana is a modern woman, a modern black woman, who slips into an older time and is forced to participate in an archaic and inhumane system in order to survive. She has to contend with the fact that this brutal and immoral system is such an intrinsic part of her bloodline that if she doesn't ensure certain abuses take place, she is erasing her and her entire family's existence. It poses a devastating question that's difficult to answer. Butler's writing flows so seamlessly that it's hard to imagine the story going in any other direction. She's quick with her pacing, her words are sharp, concise, and pointed. The concept is terrifying, the characters are calculated, and the tension leaps from the page. Kindred is, dare I say, a perfect novel. There's very little one would need to change if they wanted to, let's say, adapted into a television series. Very few of Butler's works have been adapted for much of anything.
Okay. What the hell just happened, Dana?
It was like I said, as if my heart were beating in 2 places at once. I was here, and then I was there.
In a river, rescuing a drowning child.
Huh? A young boy. He couldn't have been more than 5 or 6.
In 2017, Abrams Comic Arts published a graphic novel adaptation of Kindred, adapted by Damian Duffy and illustrated by John Jennings. The graphic novel was an accurate and hard-hitting depiction. Next to nothing changed about the story itself. Of course, most of the prose was cut for space, but the dialogue is the same, and the visuals of the world Butler created are haunting and brutal. The project made it clear that it was possible for Kindred to be adapted into a visual medium. In 2021, after a lengthy process, FX announced that they now held the rights for Kindred and would be adapting it into a television series. That same year, HBO made an official order for a pilot script based on Butler's novel Fledgling, which would have Issa Rae and J.J. Abrams attached. As of me making this video, there's no word on the development of that show, but by September of 2021, FX's Kindred project had names attached. Brandon Jacobs Jenkins, a notable playwright, became the showrunner. Janixa Bravo signed on to direct the pilot. Actors Mallory Johnson, Issa Davis, Charles Parnell, Micah Stock all signed on to join, and by the summer of 2022, filming began. Before I go into detail about the series, I want to get this out of the way. I don't think the show is a good adaptation of the novel. That's it. That's the end. I'll talk about the why, of course, but for the next few minutes, or however long it takes, I want to talk about this show as its own thing first and as an adaptation second. The common rhetoric I've heard is that Kindred is a great show for anyone who hasn't read the book. And for people who have read the book, it can be an okay show, but usually not a great one. Even though I want to talk about it as a standalone thing, I want it to be known that even as I'm trying to look at it as its own thing, I've still got the novel-tinted glasses on. That said, I don't think the season we got is a decent season of television. Despite the terrifying concept and the violence Dana experiences on her first full night on the plantation, somehow the series stagnates and offers very few stakes. Part of this is because of the pacing. The sense of urgency completely dulls as the narrative is stretched out to offer backstories that contribute next to nothing to the main plot. The only backstory that adds some dimension is that of Dana's mother, Olivia, who went missing decades earlier and who Dana discovers has been trapped in the past for years. But even this addition skews the narrative and its overall theme. Characters make decisions that are downright puzzling, and they are, how do I put this? Kind of dumb. Dumb characters can work to a story's advantage, don't get me wrong. But when these characters make the wrong decision, it doesn't up the stakes. It doesn't complicate their situation. It doesn't create a bigger hurdle for them to get over. They're just dumb. Everything in the first season is so sprawling, and direction isn't gained until the second to last episode, by which time, of course, it's too late. I know from interviews with the showrunner that everything was supposed to come together across multiple seasons, so what's set up in season 1 is set up, and it reads as such. The pilot opens with a frantic scene that puts us right in the middle of the action. It begs so many questions, designed in such a way to make you want to stick around for the answers. Our protagonist, Dana, is lying on the floor, bloodied and clearly distraught. She's obviously injured, and though we don't know the extent of her injuries yet, her pain comes across as overbearing. She starts to pack things. Food, medicine. As she scrambles with an urgency we are yet to understand, the police show up at her door. It's a tense scene, or, well, it's supposed to be a tense scene. All the makings of a great opening are there, but somehow it falls flat. The scenes after show Dana in her regular day-to-day life. She's watching an episode of Dynasty and taking notes. She wants to be a TV writer, and this is how she works on her craft.
You basically watch an episode, and you write down everything everyone does.
I do that.
We learn that Dana has just moved to Los Angeles, having made the drastic decision to sell the family brownstone in New York and purchase a house in California. When she meets with her aunt and uncle later, they are disturbed by this information, and rightfully so. Dana comes off as an immature person who can be a bit naive and makes rash decisions at the drop of a hat. When dinner with her family goes south, Dana refuses a ride from them, having had enough lecturing for the night. She plans to call an Uber, but her phone dies, and so she accepts a ride from a complete stranger. A choice that cleverly demonstrates to us that Dana has no survival skills whatsoever. The total stranger in question is Kevin, a waiter and musician who quickly takes a liking to Dana. After Dana gets home, she matches with Kevin on a dating app, and before she knows it, she's transported to the past. This begins a constant push and pull that Dana has little control over. When Dana is back in the modern world after her first visit, she thinks she's just woken up from a dream and tries to go about her life as normal. She goes on an errand disguised as a date with Kevin where she drops $7,000 on a mattress. Fuck. She and Kevin christen the mattress as soon as they move it into her bedroom, and what starts as a one-day stand ends up being a very grueling experience for the both of them. The first time, she turns over a baby that's nearly suffocating in his crib. The second time, she saves a boy from drowning. The third time, she rescues that same boy from a burning house. And it's only after getting to talk to him that she learns this place she keeps getting sent to is a plantation in the year 1814. Another character, Luke, tells her how to get to Hagar's place. Hagar is a free woman who has a little cottage near the plantation, and it's a place where Dana can be safe. When Dana arrives, she sees a familiar face. Olivia, her mother, who disappeared decades earlier. We learn that Dana's strange connection to the past has something to do with her mother, and of course, something to do with the boy whose life she keeps saving, named Rufus. Dana continues slipping through time, and on her fourth visit, she inadvertently brings Kevin with her. While there, Kevin is assumed to be Dana's master, and they fall into that lie as a means of protection. As Dana spends more time in the past, she works with Olivia to figure out how they can get back. While Dana spends most of her time reading to Rufus or planning with Olivia, Kevin spends a lot of his time in the Whalen household, teaching piano to Rufus and comforting Margaret, Tom's wife, when she's upset. After they return to their time, Kevin makes it clear to Dana that he can't go back there. We learn that he struggles with substance abuse, and he fears the absolute fuckery of this time travel experience is going to make him relapse in some way.
That experience isn't good for me, and I really don't know how to help you over there.
He offers to be there for Dana, waiting at the house when she gets back, partly so she can have someone there, and partly because Kevin is afraid that if something happens to Dana, if she gets lost in that time and goes missing in their time, he will be blamed for it. Her neighbors are certainly nosy enough, concerned enough, and know his face enough to be able to identify him. Despite this conversation, Dana still forces Kevin to go back in time with her again, and it's on this last trip that Kevin eventually gets left behind when Dana is sent back without him. The series ends with Dana in the modern day, worried about Kevin and about Olivia, who had been with Dana when she was transported. The end leaves a lot of questions unanswered, so that audiences will tune in for the second season. Where is Olivia? Will Dana be able to return to Kevin? Will Rufus and Alice still be Dana's ancestors, or will the bloodline be erased? Now those are the clip notes. How does the series fare as an adaptation of Butler's work? Does it do it justice? Especially when we consider that it is the only on-screen adaptation of anything Butler has written. I was hesitant to watch this series when it was first released because I felt protective of the novel, and I knew I wasn't in the frame of mind where I would give it a fair shake. A few years earlier, Rashid Johnson's adaptation of Native Son, the highly acclaimed Richard Wright novel, showed me just how sideways these adaptations can go. I'm always afraid, irrationally so, that something will get lost in translation. It took me until this year to watch the Kindred series, and I'm glad I waited because what I can look at now as just being a confusingly unfaithful adaptation, back then it would have brought out a lot of misplaced ire. The skeleton of the novel is mostly the same. There are structural changes, but the bones of Kindred as a series and Kindred as a novel are the same bones. The flesh and the skin, however, are vastly different. Where do we start? Dana. We have to start with Dana. I don't have the words to accurately describe the utter bewilderment I feel toward this version of Dana. All the things that make Dana a compelling character in the novel are stripped away. Oh, you're saying Book Dana has survival skills? Lame. Book Dana understands that getting caught reading can be a death sentence? That's trash. Book Dana understands the gravity of the situation, being a black woman sent back in time to a plantation, that she's constantly anxious about how her mere existence can make people want to hurt her, and that they would get away with it. No need. These changes to her character are a fatal overcorrection causing the fiery crash that is this series. Adaptations are always going to have changes. That said, rarely is it a good idea to completely rewrite a main character. Somehow Dana's savviness and intellect get dulled in the TV series, where she becomes immature, rash, and naive. Where Book Dana is well versed in struggle and knows the meaning of $1, she jumps from temp job to temp job, skips meals to stretch what little she has until the next payday, and writes extensively. She knows what she wants to do, where she wants to be, and the name of the game is to survive while she chases that dream. Book Dana is resourceful, not just because she's creative, but because her financial background forces her to be. TV Dana, in contrast, is a completely irresponsible person. Financially sexually irresponsible, emotionally irresponsible. I mean, her idea of hard work is finding the perfect mattress. I really wanted to make sure the show didn't feel like a museum piece. Part of it was, I had a tough time imagining a woman of color putting up with the Kevin energy you're getting in the book. I'm kind of fascinated by the way people involved with the series talk about Dana, book Dana, as if her characterization in the novel hasn't aged well. They talk about how a woman from 2016 wouldn't take certain things that Dana took as if they want to improve her character, as if they want to make her be bolder and more independent, but they end up taking so much away from her in the process. Dana's not as resourceful, she's not as smart, she's not as dependable, and she's not as considerate. There are a lot of things in the TV series that don't really match up with what we know of the novel, but Dana is the most jarring example. She's a completely different person. Dana doesn't figure that much out for herself, and she doesn't know much about her family. In the book, when Dana meets Rufus, he tells her they're on Wayland Plantation, and she recognizes the name. She knows her family is part of it, and she quickly puts together that Rufus is her ancestor. She understands he's the one pulling her toward him when he's in danger, and she rescues him time and time again because if he dies, her bloodline vanishes. In the show, Dana saves Rufus when he's in danger, but she doesn't seem to understand their connection. That would be fine, except when she arrives with Kevin in tow, she says,
"This is it. This is him. We have to save him."
Like she already knows that his death means her death. But she doesn't, because it's not until the next episode when her mother is telling her how they're connected to the plantation that Dana asks,
"And Reggie had family in Easton going way back."
Wait a minute. My father had ancestors here? Could Rufus be one of them?
Is butter a carb? Yes.
Dana's dependency on other people for information is just one other thing that overcrowds the series, because now we have to make room for characters to give her that information where before she deduced it herself. In the series, her aunt and uncle are big players, with her aunt doing a lot of the heavy lifting with telling her things. Olivia plays a similar role. She's the one who theorizes how time travel works and when it affects her. Now that we've made Dana kind of a dingus, we have to add in other characters to give her more information, and the series just continues to lose focus. Another big way it loses focus, we spend a lot of time in the series getting to know Kevin's ins and outs. He, much like this iteration of Dana, is no longer a writer. Kevin is a much bigger character this time around, where before we would focus mainly on Dana's experiences on and off the plantation, as well as her rapport with characters like Rufus, Alice, and Sarah. This time we dedicate large segments of the series to exploring Kevin's experiences on the plantation. They also do a disservice to Dana's character by making her relationship with the slaves in the plantation almost non-existent. It's about family. In a way, I feel like Dana needed some way to actually get under the hood of family for herself, and so that's what the mother emerged from, and also wanting her to have a reason to go back that's more than just Rufus. Like there's a reason for her to be in this space that isn't just hiding with a child in a room for hours of television. But Dana did have more to do than just be with Rufus. She had relationships she built with other people on the plantation. She was teaching Nigel how to read in secret. What are you talking about? I can't help but feel that this adaptation would have benefited from an ounce of humility. There's a grand level of cocksure needed to undergo the process of adapting a widely acclaimed novel for the screen, and doing so by fundamentally changing everything about it. Some adjustments are fine, understandable even. By setting the story in 2016, for example, there's an intent to draw parallels between that tumultuous election year, God, I can't believe we have another one, and the plantation. But the actions of the series contradict that intent. There's a lot that could be done with this change, but in execution, it's merely there. It doesn't advance the story, it doesn't heighten the themes, it doesn't present anything new or better than what came before it. It's a buzzword change that serves no other purpose than to be theorized about. I watched a few behind-the-scenes featurettes and interviews with the cast and creator. Almost everyone in the show talks about the book as if it's something they have to improve upon. In an interview with Screen Rant, Micah Stock and Mallory Johnson, who play Kevin and Dana respectively, were asked about the changes made, and Micah gave an interesting answer.
I like to think that, the narrative shifts that Brandon made were and are a reflection of, our present day being the 2000 teens as opposed to the late 1970s. And a lot of those shifts, were just a result of like heightening that mirror and making sure that the mirror we were holding up wasn't a dated one. We don't need to look at the social dynamics in regards to race as they were from 1978 to 1815. We need to look at them from now to 1815, because unfortunately they're still present.
This may just be me, but I never saw Kindred as a dated story. I still don't. Yeah, it takes place in the 70s, but it's a story about a Black American coming to terms with being a descendant of systemic oppression and abuse. For many of us, that is a timeless story. And Octavia E. Butler is kind of the master of timeless stories. I mean, people are flocking to read Parable of the Sower right now because it is scarily accurate. I also don't see anyone watching a film like A League of Their Own and saying it's dated because it takes place in 1943. It's still terribly relevant. A story that highlights women's rights and critiques the patriarchy, just as Kindred is still terribly relevant. To be clear, updating the story to the modern day isn't terrible because there's subtext that can be added, but they don't really do anything with this change. It's 2016. Characters have smartphones. Do they use them to prove that they were in the past? And while they're in the modern day connected to Wi-Fi, do they look up things they might need? For example, in the book, there's a moment where Kevin and Dana consider falsifying freedom papers that Dana can have on her whenever she gets sent back. But the problem is they don't know what those freedom papers looked like. In a story set in 2016, they could have had that conversation and even looked it up, but they don't. They could have really drawn parallels between the hatred and the cruelty they see while being in 1815 and the hateful rhetoric they're seeing in the 2016 election, but they don't. For all intents and purposes, the update of the time period does nothing. Making Dana a TV writer instead of a novelist is also an interesting change because there's no reason for it. She's still a writer at the end of the day, but in this version, she's less bookish. In the novel, Dana will draw information from books that she's read in the past. Books about everything from the abolitionist movement to Jim Crow laws. Like, she's really well versed in her history. TV Dana is not. So it almost feels like this change was made just to make Dana dumber. I'm not saying that's what it was. That's just certainly what it feels like. By far, my least favorite change is the decision to make it so Kevin and Dana are not married. They're not even longtime partners. They are not even friends. They're complete strangers who have a one-day stand. When I was watching the series for the first time, I ranted about it to everyone I knew, and this was the change that bothered me the most. After a lot of research, I found out that this is the change that bothered a lot of Kindred book fans the most. The other things I mentioned, I can at least understand. Setting the story in a more modern time period, sure. Making Dana a TV writer, okay, fine. People still read books in 2016, but sure, that's fine. Making Kevin and Dana complete strangers? Why? This change, it just creates more work than necessary. Now that Kevin is just some guy, we need to make a reason for him to care enough about staying with Dana and trying to help her in this situation. Where before, you didn't need a reason. They're married. Of course Kevin wants to make sure his wife is okay. But now Kevin is a stranger and we need a new reason, which overcomplicates the narrative because now we have to expand the roles of two minor characters that we never actually see in the novel. Kevin and Dana's neighbors who call the cops after hearing Dana scream. These characters now have names, quirks, and offer some unneeded comic relief. Their suspicions of Kevin make him reluctant to leave without Dana because if anything happens to her, he's on the line for it. He ends up going with her back in time, not because he was concerned about his wife and was trying to comfort her, not realizing what was happening, but because Dana got scared and held on to him even though she already knew that whatever she was holding on to would end up going back with her. Like the neighbor's cat. One of the more stressing moments in the novel is after a long stretch of time Kevin and Dana have spent living on the plantation. Quite suddenly, Dana is sent back to the modern day, and Kevin is running toward her, but he doesn't reach her in time. She arrives without Kevin, and since time moves much faster when they're outside of it, when she finally does return, it's been years for Kevin. years of living in a society that has normalized slavery and racial injustice. I had a lot of fear the first time I read this passage. I was afraid that by the time Dana came back, he wouldn't be the Kevin she knew, that he would be corroded and cruel. By making Kevin a complete stranger, the emotional stakes of these moments thin into nothing. They barely know each other, so there's no fear of a loved one becoming an unrecognizable person. There's just nothing. In interviews, people keep saying that Kevin not being married to Dana actually makes their bond stronger because Kevin stays with her even though he doesn't owe her anything. However, that is not what happens in the show. Kevin would go if he could, but he feels like he has to stay with Dana because the neighbors think he's a suspicious individual. If anything happens to her, if she disappears, he is fucked. That's not love, that's fear of going to jail for a crime you didn't commit. In this period, I think Butler was still quite coy, and the readership was considered coy. In the original book, sex is almost never alluded to. The marriage between Kevin and Dana feels quite chaste in a lot of ways. I don't know, maybe their marriage feels chaste, and maybe they're not talking about sex or having it because they keep getting sent back to a plantation. In the book, we're actually getting the story of their marriage and these flashbacks at the top of chapters, and we knew we weren't going to be able to cover the whole book in the first season. So we asked, there's gotta be a way to play this relationship in real time. I'm gonna repeat that. In the book, we're actually getting the story of their marriage and these flashbacks at the top of chapters, and we knew we weren't going to be able to cover the whole book in the first season. So we asked, there's gotta be a way to play this relationship in real time. Did you catch it? Did you catch how there wasn't enough time to cover Kevin and Dana's marriage in the first season, so instead they started from scratch and made them complete strangers? It's easy to miss. I hate to bring up the marriage thing because I know it's the thing that the showrunner and the writers and even the actors have had to hear over and over again. They're probably tired of it.
Kevin and Dana aren't married in the show like they are in the books. How do you think that kind of...
But it is a question you can't help but ask, especially now that the show is out and over, because we can see how much it didn't work. In an interview with Collider, Jenkins said this: "In the book, those characters are married, which is a huge sticking point for a lot of people. But we had this desire, myself and the writers, to challenge ourselves to see if we could really depict, in real time, the evolution of an interracial marriage. Could we actually go from 0 to 100 over the time allotted for us? And we wanted to really take our time and slow it down and really see if we can demarcate the steps that people take in order to really fall in love and commit to each other. We wanted to take our time and slow it down, but also we didn't have enough time to cover the book." Huh? To give credit where credit's due, Jenkins did a lot of work adapting this show. In interviews, he talks about the process that took over 6 years, and from the way he talks about Butler, her work is important to him. In one interview with Script Magazine, he said that once the show was sold, he started reading everything he could, including early drafts of Butler's original manuscript. The creation of Olivia, a character we don't see in the official version of the novel, is allegedly partly inspired by a character Jenkins says existed in an earlier draft. I think this shows a great amount of dedication, and I admire the work that it must have taken to research all of it. But I still don't understand how taking things from a draft of the novel that Butler ultimately decided to cut makes it a better adaptation. In her many drafts of Kindred, Butler experimented with alternate endings in which Dana was able to intervene into the historical past in more transformative ways. For example, in one version, Dana brings her ancestor Alice into 1976 with her, saving her from Rufus's brutality. In another, a second time traveler shows up to help slaves escape. She abandoned all of them. History would absorb neither Dana's nor Butler's interventions. The task was not to transform history, but to survive it. And Dana does survive, though not wholly intact. The series is continually described by those involved as an enrichment of the novel, a much-needed expansion that gives characterization to characters who maybe didn't play that big of a role in the novel, but somehow it does so by making those characters more one-dimensional than they were before. One of the things that really stuck out to me in this series was the pacing, partly because of how the plot develops throughout the season. A lot of nothing happens until the second to last episode when everything suddenly hits the fan. Again, Now that Kevin and Dana are strangers, a good amount of time is dedicated to developing their relationship. Because the series wants to expand on Dana's family, we also spend a lot of time creating a narrative that her mother was sent back in time years ago and wasn't able to come back. The decision is also made to not show Rufus growing up. He stays the same age for most of the season, and this removes the development of seeing him change into a more violent, hateful person as he gets older. It takes away the devastation Dana felt at realizing her influence on him as a child wasn't enough to change who he was always going to be. The big portrait of the novel is Dana having to accept that her family existence was dependent on the systemic cruelty. And that's gone too. Because a lot of these things are taken away, the narrative doesn't move toward anything. The worst part is why these changes were made. They wanted this show to be an ongoing series, not a limited one. Kindred is far from the first series to be written with the intent of having multiple seasons. It's the most grating example though. Butler wrote a complete story, a great one, and I don't know how anyone could expand on what she did in a way that improves on the story. And seeing as Kindred was cancelled after one season, I don't think we'll ever find out. When I found out this show was intended to have multiple seasons, so many of the other decisions started to make sense. The pacing felt off. It's not until the final episode that things start to pick up, and then, boom, it's over. Oh well, I guess I can just imagine that the second season would have explored the same themes explored in the novel. This isn't an adaptation of Kindred, it's more of a rewriting of Kindred, and it's disappointing. There aren't any other on-screen adaptation of Octavia E. Butler's work, and while I'm sure that won't always be the case, this series will always be the first one, and the fact that it does such a disservice to Butler by essentially rewriting her entire story is just, it makes me sad. It's very easy for Black women and their art to be overlooked or erased, and I think this show had an opportunity to introduce new audiences to Butler's words, an opportunity to give visuals to her poetic prose, to do her work justice, but instead of doing that, they gutted the story and paraded its husk around.
You need to get a grip before you come for me, because this is not okay. You are not okay!
Mubi is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from all around the globe. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there's always something new to discover. With Mubi, each and every film is hand-selected by its team of curators. Discover the best of cinema at your fingertips, streaming anytime, anywhere. I want to give a shout out to the Mubi Retrospective. Another year has passed, a year of cinematic highs and lows, but this year Mubi has created a fun highlight of films available on the platform and what kind of viewer would enjoy them most. The retrospective highlights films that were popular among subscribers and recommends some based on your previous interests. For example, there's a section of recommendations for mythologists and coming-of-age fanatics, which, funnily enough, both describe myself. Speaking of coming-of-age fanatics, I have to throw my own little recommendation in there for a movie that has come to be quite near and dear to my heart this year, and that is Ariane Louisiez's Humanist Vampire Seeking Consenting Suicidal Person. As soon as I heard about this movie, I was stoked to see it because it's the kind of thing that I gravitate towards. I love vampire stories, but I love them even more when the vampires are experiencing some sort of existential crisis, as we have established. Vampires are these mythical, beyond powerful creatures, and the idea of them struggling with their identities and struggling with immortality, I don't know, man. I just love that stuff. I eat it up. I also have a soft spot for insightful coming-of-age stories that are teeming with warmth, and Humanist Vampire has equal amounts of each element, and it is so good. The film follows Sasha, a teenager in vampire years, as she tries to come to terms with her existence as a vampire and her stance as a humanist who doesn't want to kill anyone. It's very funny, dark, refreshing, and just all around heartwarming, really. If this movie sounds like it's right up your alley, then please take advantage of this offer and give it a watch. It's currently streaming on Mubi in the US and the UK. You can try Mubi free for 30 days at mubi.com/Yarazade. That is mubi.com/Yarazade for a whole month of great cinema for free. you.